the entirety of the 19th century or the 1800s are just revivals after revivals, whether it's classical revivals, Gothic revival, medieval revival, or even revivals from other areas of the world. The 19th century generally doesn't have anything that's super new. It doesn't really have a style to define it. It just kind of borrows from every era and every continent. On Wednesday, we talked about industrialization. So we talked about the introduction of iron and glass. But notice that the styles that we are using are still very traditional, very eclectic. It's not really anything that you haven't seen before. It's just the materiality that changes. But today we're going to talk about a movement that is completely new, that does introduce a whole new style of architecture. And it comes as a result of several things. So first of all, we have increasing urbanization. Just a quick chart I found online, but we have London at the head of this, New York City. All of our industrial cities are really, really growing, and there just isn't enough housing, so conditions are pretty bad. Nice postcard, complimenting the smoke. So this is what most industrial cities look like at the time. As you can imagine, it's not really a great time to be someone that isn't a part of that upper class. These are some cartoons that come from France, actually. So this one was created, and you can see that they have this heavy machinery at the basement level, and then right above that you do have all the textile machines, and there's, if you look really closely, there are babies in there, there's children, everything is mixed together, people literally work, there's no hygiene, and then later they devised this new system, but notice that there's a very definitive hierarchy to it as well, right? So on the bottom level, we have our working class, so we have our servants over here, and then we have our shop owners, since this is the street. On the first floor, or the piano noble, right, the noble floor, we have our upper class people. So all of the people who would have had something lived at Versailles are now staying in these luxury apartments on that first floor for Europeans. And then as you go up, it begins to get lower and lower, right? So then you have the middle class above that, the lower class, and finally at the top you have your struggling artists. You have other people who are servants for different households, maybe for the middle class, but you have this very harsh hierarchy of class systems. And because of that, we do have posters like these that pretty much are a heavy critique of the capitalist system. So you can see at the very top, you have your monarchy. So it's almost like that one diagram I've been showing you all of these past lectures, except now it's criticizing that system, right? So we have our monarchy at the top, and even though they have constitutions now, they do have certain limitations of power. They are still very abusive of the lower classes. We have the clergy, our soldiers, our middle class, and finally the working class at the bottom. So for today's movement, we're really going to be talking about that middle class. Notice that they are being criticized here, even though they're not upper class and they are middle class, they are still the people that own and work the factories. That is how they make their wealth. So they do very much exploit that lower class. But there is a group of people within the middle class that wants to change that. They want to reform the world. They want to do something that's much more clean, better working conditions for everyone. They're trying to be more enlightened, if you will. And those people are going to be the ones that are going to form what we call the art nouveau movement. So this is the type of arts that we are portraying. If you look at it very closely, there's a lot of natural motifs going on, very soft curves everywhere. It is very much a reaction against the very harsh industrial nature of the city at the end of the 19th century. So whereas before they had these like stuffy Victorian gowns and the all black, it looked very prudish. They are now using much softer textiles. They're draping their textiles using softer colors. This one, of course, is showing us a modern day romance. This is the type of art that we're going to start seeing and is embraced by this new middle class. So the rise of the movement we're going to talk about today, which is the Art Nouveau or the New Art Movement, is brought about by these two things. First off, an acceptance of the Industrial Revolution and the idea of change. So whereas last week we talked about the introduction of iron and glass, and we talked about the rejection of it, this week we're going to talk about them fully embracing it and using it openly. They're not going to try to hide it. They are not going to try to dress it up with anything so it looks more proper. They're instead going to embrace the fact that times are changing, and you might as well make it something beautiful. Secondly, this new middle class wants to break away from the past and start fresh. They do not like the idea of exploiting the lower classes, and in part, they are new money, right? And because of that, they are shunned by those upper classes, the existing middle class. They are not seen as equals. So rather than trying to fit into that class, they're going to try to start something new for themselves and exclude everyone else who doesn't want to be a part of it. And lastly, we just have more industrial products. So the time of making handcrafted buildings is slowly fading away, and they understand that, right? Again, they are middle class, they are not upper class, they cannot necessarily afford to make super expensive buildings. So they're going to fully embrace industrial materials. So we're going to see France and Brussels first, and then we're going to see the rest of Europe. If you are familiar with Klimt, he is Art Nouveau. So this is the type of art, this is the time period we're going to be talking about, and what corresponds architecturally. So the 5 styles, or the 6 characteristics, are number 1, we need a new style that is expressive of what they believe is going to be the new century. So this is happening in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s. They believed that the Art Nouveau was going to be the style of the 20th century. We know that it isn't, that modernism is what ultimately takes over. But for them, they were trying to break. And this was the first time that they have a conscious break from classical architecture. So in the entirety of European history, this movement, Art Nouveau, is the first time that they have that clean break. And I think that's the answer to number 1. All right, number 2, looking to nature for inspiration. So you saw all of those plates I showed you, this one over here, lots of natural motifs, lots of curves, sinusoidal pieces. They are not doing very harsh 90-degree angles, nothing too orthogonal, very organic. Number 3, lots of interest in surface ornaments and patterns, which we will see shortly. Number 4, open use of iron. So they're not just using it and hiding it, but they are embracing it. Number 5, what we call totality in design, which is probably the most important characteristic for today. What totality in design refers to is that everything within that building, from the floors to the furniture to the lighting, the facade, absolutely everything is done in the same style. So the idea of something having an aesthetic arises during the tail end of the 19th century, and Art Nouveau is the one that really embodies that idea. So we're going to see all the pieces we're going to look at today have the same idea behind it. And lastly, we have the national variations on these themes. So every country we look at is going to look quite different, but you'll notice that they have those 5 characteristics. So if you didn't catch the answer to number 1, it's just a break from classical architecture. All right. So today we're going to be looking at 5 countries, and we're going to be exploring them through a singular designer, but keep in mind that there are many designers that are doing this type of Art Nouveau. It's just that these are the most prevalent ones to give you an idea of what's going on in different areas of Europe. But this is an international style. It is something that sweeps over the whole of Europe. We're going to start with Belgium. So you'll notice most of these are going to be very modest pieces, because again, this is the rising middle class. This is not upper class. So we're not going to have these large Versailles type of palaces. Instead, we're going to have something that looks more like this. And one of the goals of the Art Nouveau is to create a sanctuary in the home. Because industrialization is so dirty, it's loud, it's disrupting family patterns, the home becomes a sort of sanctuary from the urban state. And designers really try to incorporate as much nature into that in order to give you that escape and that relief from the urban fabric within your home. So this is a multi-story townhouse in Brussels. This one is called the Castle House. So it's the central one right here. And I want you to notice how different the language of it is from the 2 buildings next to it. It might not be too apparent, but notice that the windows on the middle panel are just glass and iron. There are no stone supports there compared to what's going on next door. Right, so next door you have these punch outs from the stone architecture. In the Tassel House, all of this has absolutely no stone inside of it, right? So these are stone, but if you look at it, they're in front of the iron and glass curtain. So if you think about modernism, right, we think about curtain walls, which are all iron or aluminum and glass with no stone or heavy supports, and that's what's going on right here. So we're beginning to see a little bit of a move right there. There's a close-up so you can get a better idea of what I mean, right? So all of these are metal supports, and they're very thin, and they make this wall look like it's disappearing there. For us, it might not seem that way since we're used to seeing buildings that are completely clad in glass, where we wouldn't even see these mullions, but for the time period, this was considered very translucent, transparent, and open. All right, so as you walk in, I think you can begin to see that this style has nothing to do with anything that we've looked at before. There's no classicism in here, right? We don't have any capitals, no entablatures. We don't really have the same type of arches we've been seeing. There's nothing about it that's really Gothic. It's just purely inspired by nature, right? So this is as you come in, right? So you come in through here, and then it has this kind of little staircase. So if you look out into the entryway, this is what we mean by totality in design. Everything is designed with the same idea: the railings, the doorway, the lighting, the iron supports. And then if you go further back, you can see that they have these harder type of pieces, but notice that they are separating their rooms not with solid walls and panels, but with glass. So there is lots of transparency going on in this house. The house does have this kind of split level motif, so that I feel that as if it expands once you get into this area back here, which really accentuates the idea of it being a sanctuary as you get into your home. This is just a really cool rendered section, right? So if you look at that piece right there, that staircase, that's probably the most famous part of this house, and this is what it looks like. So some of you have probably seen this image before. This is probably the definition of Art Nouveau. So again, everything is made in the same style, the mosaics are made in the same style. The staircase has these really soft curves that invite you to go upstairs. So they're not very rigid or orthogonal pieces. The lighting inside of it, the coloring, all of it really contributes to create an environment inside of the building. Nowadays it is a hotel, but originally it was a home for a pretty large middle class family. The next one we're going to be looking at is the Soleil house, which we see right here. So it's a little bit larger, right? And it has this double bay, but notice that we do still have the full curtain wall going on right there. So these are not very thick stone supports. They are made out of metal. So this whole front piece is glass. And you can see that even next door in this building that we clearly tell is much more modern, probably from the 60s, 50s, they don't use the glass in the same way, right? It's still very much punctured into the masonry compared to what's going on at the end of the 19th century. So it's quite modern for their time. Yes?
Last class you mentioned an example of like the iron rod that was in the middle of one of the rooms we were looking at. And it had like I think they were like welded on.
The leaf looking?
Yes. Is this going to be like when we start seeing that a lot more?
So that one was more so a playful form of exoticism. So they still believed there was a capital with a palm tree at the top. In this case, the only reason it's splayed out like that is because structurally they're trying to create these trees that support, if that makes sense. But they didn't really see it as being a capital because they're trying to break away from classicism.
Gotcha.
So yes, it's similar in form structurally, but the idea is different. Right, so in this case, open balconies. You can tell that this is the noble floor because of the use of balconies, so you can go out and look onto the streets, rustic face, right? Notice that they're using rivets in this case. They are not hiding it. They are fully embracing that this is a house that is made with industrial materials. And then in plan, you can see this is also going to be oriented around that staircase. So in this case, we do have this kind of double staircase that comes into a central one. So you enter in this doorway, again, totality in design. And then you come into this large staircase, right? So notice the forms are not square, again, they're very nice and rounded. The staircase itself looks like something out of the Titanic, which did have Art Nouveau styles inside of it as well. And then it kind of curves around itself. Openings of iron, glass. So although it's using industrial materials, Art Nouveau is showing us that these materials don't necessarily have to look very frivolous. They can actually be very cozy if we design they're gonna have these really beautiful patterns, usually some kind of nature imagery, and that's in order to bring in more daylight. Remember that these are townhomes that don't necessarily have that many windows on all the sides, so the more skylights you can have, the better to illuminate that home. These are their parlors, right? So it's made completely out of wood, handcrafted. It's one of the things about the Art Nouveau, it does take a lot of work still, even though they are industrialized materials, you do still have to have someone that has craftsmanship and knows how to weld, and knows how to carve these pieces. So that's ultimately one of the reasons the Art Nouveau doesn't work. Alright, and then here's one of the last pieces that we'll look at in Belgium. So this was supposed to be a town hall for the Socialist Democratic Party. Unfortunately, it does not exist anymore. I'll show you what they replaced it with. But this is by the same designer, and I think you can see that he's taken the idea of the curtain wall a step further here, so the entirety of this is made of glass. You can see that these are studies towards here, but everything in between here and over there is just glass.
Excuse me, what did you say they were?
Glass curtain wall?
No, you said they were like service points or something like that?
The function of the building?
Yeah, never mind. The bottom part right there, where the horses are. You said it was a service point or something like that?
So not in this case. In this case, it's shops because it's
Shops. Okay.
So yeah, they're gonna have shops at the bottom. They're gonna have a cafe, an assembly room, auditorium. It's basically a headquarters for a political party at the time.
Gotcha.
So this is a propaganda from the time for that socialist party and that building in particular. So this is the type of ideology that's driving it. And I think you can see how Art Nouveau is used as a message of being a break from the past, right? So they're using these new radical ideas and meshing them with what is considered a new radical architecture to kind of symbolize this break from the past. And of course, it is rooted in the people themselves, right? So it's giving power to the people, not to the upper classes or the one person that's all the way up at the top. The shape of the building also dictates that, so it's quite open in order to house the people that are coming in. So it's very similar to the Baroque churches we looked at, these arms coming up to invite the people back in. In this case, it is a town hall, and it belongs to the Socialist Democratic Party, who is trying to bring people in and gain their votes, give them these resources, this cafe to hang out in. So it's trying to really lure them in and get their votes. It is quite large, it has multiple stories, multiple functions. It is a multi-use building. There is at the time, you can see the red flags waving at the top right. And there is how it opens, right? So normally this would have finished in a clean cut corner over here. But rather than doing that, they do carve out the space in the city and they give that back to the people. Today it's been replaced in this building, so that entirety of the facade, you can see they kept the shape generally, but they did destroy the entirety of the building, and then they built this 12th tower on top of it. So it does not exist anymore, unfortunately. But when it did exist, you can see Victor Porta using a lot of the same techniques that he used in the homes inside of that top assembly room. So he does light it up very nicely, brings in a lot of natural daylight through skylights, clear stories, curtain wall in the back over here, right? So he doesn't want this to be a stuffy parliament assembly room like the ones that are traditionally used by the monarchy. He wants it to be something fresh and new. And you can see the whole structure reads very lightly. Even these balconies right here, they don't seem like they're weighing down on the architecture. This is another part of it with this big dome, right? I think you can see a little bit more of that Titanic type of architecture in this case with a big glass dome. But it's very open, it allows lots of daylight, it allows you to see what other people are doing, right? So this idea of the architecture being transparent and being honest and telling you what it's truly catering to becomes popular at the time. Now in France, I'm going to show you some metro stations. Okay? So a lot of these still exist. If you ever go to Paris, you'll see a couple of them. But this is what we call zoomorphism. So zoomorphism is when you take animals and you use them to directly inspire your architectural pieces. So in this case, this is a good example. You saw the metro has these kind of eyes looking down overhead. I'm going to turn on the lights since we can't really see the color that well. has a zoomorphic quality where it looks like it's this creature that's looking at you, right? So you can see it a little bit better right here. The panels themselves look like bugs, they look like leaves. The thing about Art Nouveau is that it abstracts nature. So that idea of abstraction is something that we get from this time period. It's not that the modernists invented the idea of making abstract art. They simply borrowed it from the Art Nouveau and they simplified it. Right, so right here, you can tell it's vaguely natural looking. We don't really know what it is, and that's the point. Over here, we have these eyes, where they're supposed to resemble these eyes. Right, notice how they do have the iron coming down. So it's almost like whatever this creature is, it's glaring at you. It has some type of expression. And you can see that the bulb itself does have this kind of veining going across it. So it's not just a red, flat bulb, but we see the totality of the design even down to how they make the glass. There is that close-up of the panel. And we do have several examples of them. So they have these different bug or like skeletal type of creatures all over Paris. In this case, it was kind of like one of those prehistoric bugs, the ones that they find in fossils. I'm blanking on the name of it right now. But you can see they're using iron and glass openly in public, and something that is meant to be used by everyone, and they're not hiding it or shying away from it at all. And notice that even the font that they're using over here on the signage gives you this idea of it being a more natural type of motif, right? They do have larger stations like this one, so the entirety of it is kind of like a mini building made out of iron and glass with no stone. It's simply an industrial type of architecture. This is what it would have looked like back in the day when it first opened, right? So you can see the type of people that were in Paris at the time. You can see the type of environment. And you can see how new the Art Nouveau is in comparison to everything that's around it in the rest of the city. In Britain, in England specifically, Art Nouveau didn't catch on as much because their upper classes were very, very conservative, and so the middle class didn't really have as much of an impact when it came to this new Art Nouveau style. They mostly just had new fabrics that they were using. But where it really took a hold was Scotland. So we're going to talk about the Glasgow School of Art next. And if you think about Scottish architecture, the vernacular of just a plain, run-of-the-mill Scottish home, that's pretty much what you're going to see in Macintosh's architecture, right? So they're using the vernacular of their respective countries. It looks like it belongs in that specific place, and yet they have the same prevailing themes everywhere. So first off, I want you to notice in the plan that we do have a hallway with separate rooms now. So the idea of the corridor does come to pass in the 19th century compared to our French palaces where you have to go from room to room to room. In this case, you do give a bit of independence to each of the rooms, right? They do have an architecture school here as well. This is the library we're currently looking at extensively. So on the second floor, you can see this is for junior architects. And then for the ones who pass and eventually get in, you have your senior architects room. And notice that all of these are ornament rooms. Why are they ornament rooms? Because a big part of Art Nouveau is knowing how to make ornamentation, again, not just for the building shell, but for the furniture and everything that goes on inside of it. So you need to teach people how to do that in order to keep creating this type of architecture. From the front, you can see it does look like it belongs in Scotland, right? It has that vernacular stone. But you can begin to see that they're breaking apart the stock a little bit, right? So it does have this really interesting curvature to it right here. But generally, if you had seen this and you didn't know any better, it almost looks like an early modernist piece, right? So again, we're beginning to dematerialize that wall. That's a full curtain wall right there. Full clear story up here. There's a little bit of the Art Nouveau shining through, right? You have this kind of chintzy piece. And then if you look at the iron that's decorating it on the front, it's a little bit more subtle to the French or even the Belgian version, but notice that you do have these kind of like flower pieces, right? So rather than just making these square pieces or kind of balcony around your window, they did this inside of it looks like. So this is where the library is going to be. Notice it almost looks like factory type of architecture, which is interesting given that the whole point of Art Nouveau is to look more natural. But again, I think you can see we're beginning to move into what is going to be modernist architecture. So inside of the library, we have this room. It's quite dark, at least in these images. So I'll show you this one instead. So you can see everything in here is made from the same material with the same motifs. So notice how we do have these linear motifs on the tables. We have them over there on balusters. We have them in the lighting pieces, in the chairs, in the book stacks, in the doors. Everything has the same patterning going on, and that is because it is all designed by the same person, right? So during this time, if you were an architect, you did have to know how to design lighting pieces, doors, chairs, tables, and most architects did begin there, and they took pride in that. So their training, they first had to create things like furniture, and from there they began to escalate until they got to the building scale. Whereas today, we tend to build really large, we tend to do our massing first, and then work outside in. So you can see even the lighting has that same motif going on. Now, unfortunately, this place did burn down in 2014, and funny enough, it was because an architecture student had a flammable, like, I don't know, like an aerosol or something, and it caught on fire, and it burned down pretty much the entirety of the school, but it has since been restored. So it looks like this again. You can see it reads a little bit lighter. We just need to furnish it now. This is a restaurant that the same designer in Scotland designed. So he pretty much just did this bottom portion, but you can see, again, full curtain up here, and it's asymmetrical. So notice that we're no longer doing the symmetry thing that classical architecture was all about. Instead, they are leaning into the asymmetrical use of components and massing, and they're not afraid to do it. And then notice up here, all of this does not really have any supports, which makes you wonder, how is this being sustained? It's probably a huge, huge header overhead right here. And then this is the interior. So this one is a lot lighter than that other room. You can see that he's predominantly using the color white. It is a tea room after all. Lots of daylight, right? And these are just a couple of close-ups from the Willow tea rooms. So notice that the glass and the mirrors that he's using is also designed. So rather than just using a plain, glass or mirror panel, he does design it, and he does hand paint every single one of these. So a lot of craftsmanship, again, is still required to do all of this. There is a famous Macintosh chair. So if you've ever seen it, now you know what it's by. Very exaggerated. You can see that he's celebrating a bit of industrialization. He's not as organic as perhaps the continental designers, but like I said, that's kind of what Art Nouveau is. Everyone does it a little bit different in their own style, and even in Scotland, you're going to have designers have a different approach to it. This is the fireplace. He does famously use a lot of black, white, and blue. Those are his kind of three colors that you'll see everywhere. And then if you think back to the Glasgow School, when we have those iron flowers in front of the windows, he's bringing back that same motif. All right. So now we're going to head down to Spain. And Spain is, at least my personal favorite version of the Art Nouveau. We're going to talk about Antonio Gaudí. So he's probably one of the top 5 designers that you should know, one of the most famous architects of all time. We're going to be looking at 2 of his projects today, the 2 most famous ones. We're going to start with Casa Mila. So the story behind this building is, at the time in Barcelona, they did have this street, kind of like the main artery of the city, where everyone that was someone had coming on, right? And so you had these 2 industrialists, there was a couple, they were in charge of textile factories, and they wanted to create this home that would allow them to elevate themselves and be on the street on the same level as everyone else. And so they hired Antonio Gaudí, who was a prominent designer at the time, to make them a home. So their idea was they were going to have shops on the ground floor, they themselves were going to live on that first floor, and then they were going to have apartments that they could rent and have income from so that they could retire early. Now, Gaudí, being Gaudí, did not follow what would have been at the time the code, and I think you can see that he not only goes over the height limits, but he also encroaches upon what would be the property line with all of the balconies, and then he does have a very prominent column that goes onto the sidewalk. And so you have a bunch of inspectors and city officials coming over to the site and constantly telling them to take down certain pieces. And Gaudí is very, very firm about keeping the design exactly as it is. And he tells them, I'll cut down the column, but if I do that, you're gonna have to let me put up a sign that says this column has been cut down by the city. So eventually we have the higher ups come over, they see what everything is about, and they allow Gaudí to do this because he's Gaudí. But the caveat is they do have to pay 100,000, whatever their currency was in Spain at the time, which is a lot of money. So the owners are very mad at Gaudí now because he could have just designed that column out and it wouldn't have been a problem, but instead he decides to leave it there, and so they sue him. And in the end, they lose, and so Gaudí ends up getting like 200,000 in that currency. He gives it over to a notary, and he leaves. They eventually do get their home, but it does go through a lot of ridicule, mockery, it's put in the newspapers. I'll show you one of the caricatures that comes out of it. This is what the general plan looks like though. So in Barcelona, when you are in a corner, you do have to cut it off at the end right there, so that you do have this octagon of space in the city grid. He does introduce two kind of atrium pieces, right? Courtyard pieces. This is what his idea of it was, all these bubbles kind of coming in together. You can see the planning is very, very organic. This would pretty much be any contractor's worst nightmare because of all the different angles that are going on. And again, this is part of why Art Nouveau does not become the style of the century. It's just too much work and it's too expensive, even when you use industrialized methods. Right, so this is one of the cartoons that they were making at the time to make fun of the owners and Gaudí. They thought he was kind of like a clown architect, but I think it goes to show, even when people don't like your architecture, I think that's a good sign, right? So they thought it was going to be like a Zeppelin garage. Now Gaudí does take very specific inspiration from a certain type of creature, and I think you guys will begin to see what types of animals he's looking at just by the types of motifs he's using. So these are his railings, and they look very much like seaweed, right? So these aren't the florals that are being used in Paris or in Scotland. Instead, he's using seaweeds. So he's using a lot of sea inspiration. And the whole point of the Casa Mila is to look as though it's been eroded by the ocean itself, right? So it looks like a grotto. Notice that these are all individual stone pieces that have to be hand carved, but notice how seamlessly they fit together. So if they were to plaster over this, it would look like this beautiful undersea grotto. So there's a little bit more of that seaweed. And even though it doesn't look as maybe finished or as neat as the flowery pieces that were being used in Belgium, this is a lot of work to make it look this distressed and make it look this organic when you're working with a material that's very, very hard. So notice that even in this piece right here, they do use this like little spiral piece of seaweed over here. And then the whole structure of this place looks like it's sea creature bones. So notice how he articulates his columns. They are not columns with capitals, but instead they look like bones. So he does tend to do that a lot. So another example of zoomorphism, but again, in this case, he's not taking inspiration from bugs, but from sea creatures. So as you enter, you go into one of these open courtyards. Notice that the door again has this totality of design going on. This is where the guardsmen would sit at, right? And then you enter into the courtyard itself. And all of it, again, the railings, the bony structure that's going on, the windows, everything that you see here does not have a single straight edge to it. Because according to Gaudí, there are no straight edges in nature. And being that he's emulating nature, he doesn't want to use them in the architecture. Which is again, part of the reason why this doesn't last. It's so difficult to build and it's very time consuming. Notice the way in which the column touches the ceiling over here. It's not simply kind of going into it, but it does give it this organic quality, like it's almost splashing into the ceiling itself. He does incorporate nature literally into the architecture itself, so he adds these kind of glowing planters. So as you go up the stairs, you have these hanging sea leaves, if you will, coming out of those planters. Barcelona is in the Catalan region of Spain. They have kind of a very intense relationship with the government of Spain because they were conquered 400 years prior to this under Ferdinand and Isabella, the same people who sent people over to the Americas with Christopher Columbus. So they do retain their culture very fiercely, and part of it is seen in the materiality and especially in the ceramics that they use. So you'll notice that Gaudi's architecture isn't just like Spanish architecture, but it's very specifically Catalan architecture. So you're not going to see this type of stuff in Madrid because it is specific to the people of the region of Barcelona. Inside, this is what those hallways look like if you were wondering what they look like, very organic. Notice that it is not straight edge across this tile over here. Even that has a curve to it, right? Windows everywhere to let in lots of daylight. The patterning, again, on the floors takes a lot of work. You have to hand make these molds and then cast each one of them and make sure that they don't crack, make sure that they all come out correctly, and then put them together. And then his roofscape is probably one of the most interesting things he does. So this is the entirety of the roof, and that's part of why this thing ended up being so tall when it could have just been a very clean mansard roof. So we do cover ventilation of the attic itself, and then he does have all of these chimney pieces for all of the apartments down below sticking out like porcupines on the top. So this is what the attic looks like. This is the structure of that roof underneath it. If you go visit it today, that's where the museum is located, in the attic level. And then the chimneys, notice that they are not just made out of concrete, but they are made out of mosaic tiles. So even more handcrafted work, even in a place where traditionally people wouldn't really be up there, or they wouldn't be able to see it from the street level. If you do go at night, they do fold into the zoomorphic quality, and they do project like animal type of inspired projections onto there. So some sea creature type of shapes. So I think it's even more expensive if you buy the night experience to go to the Casa Mila, but I would say it's definitely worth it. And then his most famous piece, the one you all have probably seen, is the main church of Barcelona, the Sagrada Familia. So famously, it is still under construction, but it is set to be done in 2026. So if you're planning to go to Spain, just wait a year or two so you can see it completely finished. It is what we call a Gothic revival in Art Nouveau style. So you'll notice that there is some Gothicness to it as far as the structure, the fact that it's being built over 2-3 centuries at this point. But notice in the plan, even though this is a Latin cross, it looks like an animal, even in plan. It looks like a bear, sea creatures, whatever you want to see in it. It doesn't look like a traditional boring Latin cross. It does have a lot of zoomorphic qualities, like everything from the stairs, the way the columns are arranged in the front, the way that the apse is done at the top. And Gaudí does have very specific inspiration for this. So he's one of those architects that's not only an architect, but an artist, a scientist. And when he devises the structure for the Sagrada Familia, he does have these sandbags with wires and chains, and he uses them to inspire his curves. So when you guys get to structures, if you're not already in structures, you'll learn of this concept. It's called, I'm blanking on it right now, but basically when you design a structure, you want to use what gravity would naturally give you in order to have the path of least resistance, right? So by doing this, he's emulating, if you turn it upside down, the shapes that would naturally occur, and it is turning them upside down. And because they're naturally occurring, nature helps you with the structure, if that makes sense. It's not working against it because it's what the material naturally would want to do. So this is one of the transepts. Most people think that this is the front of it. The front isn't actually done. This is just one of the arms that you can enter on. Heavily carved. It also ocean if you look at it closely, right? There is this sense of having stalagmites, right? Stalagmites coming from the bottom. There is a family itself with Jesus. We do have our stained glass, but notice that it looks like it's underwater, like it's a grotto. It doesn't look the same way that the French Gothic cathedrals would have looked like. This is the other transept entrance, and notice that they are non-patching. So while one of them looked like it was heavily carved and beat by the ocean and it was very rough, this one is actually very smooth, and this one reads more like these skeletal pieces of some kind of animal that just washed ashore. Right, so very smooth. So we see the dichotomy of all the different styles that Gaudi is bringing into this singular piece of architecture. He's showing us everything that he's capable of doing. And then this is eventually what the front is going to look like. So this part isn't done yet. It'll be done in 2026. But the front, you can see, doesn't have the bowing and it doesn't have that like carved cave-like quality. Instead, it's going to have all these kind of porcupine pieces in the front. On the top, he's using the same techniques as the Casanova. He's using mosaics and color to bring more presence into the spires up top. And again, you can't really see this detail from the ground, which tells you how much craftsmanship is being put into this piece, and that's why it's taken so long to complete it. In section, I'm sure you all recognize what we now know as our flying buttress, right? So notice that even though the shapes of it are more organic, more bone-like, they are still doing very much the same thing. They're supporting that main cathedral wall from the side. And then from the interior, this is what it looks like, right? So notice the trees, or the columns, are trying to emulate trees at the top, in part because you need the structure to do that. So whereas in the Gothic cathedrals of France, you have the vaults, here we do have these tree columns, but also in part because they resemble nature, right? It's a very difficult piece of architecture to understand because he does have a lot of hidden light sources. So we're seeing that a lot of ideas from the Baroque play into this. This is what it looked like before they put in the stained glass. So you can see the supports of it, again, are not straight, but they are carved to resemble bones, exoskeletons, organic type pieces. And then once the stained glass was put in, they did create it so that it had this really gradual rainbow motif, and it creates this really, really beautifully illuminated space in the side panels, right? So if you think back to our Gothic lecture, the three things we're looking for are verticality, which he clearly does, skeletonized walls, which he literally does in this case, and then the transformation of light and color, which is very obviously being done here. And notice that the way it was designed, the light and the color are bouncing back into the church. They're being reflected by that stone because it's so white, and it's really illuminating that space altogether. So even though Gaudi did not live to see the finished product, his ideas are still being used, and you can see that they're very functional. They still work. He did think this out very thoroughly. So I'm going to show you really quickly what has yet to be done. So this is a super quick kind of graphic. So all of the white that's appearing is what has yet to be done according to this from 2018. So a lot of these have been done already, but they do have to finish that roof portion still. They do have to add in spires at the top, and then they do have to finish in front of it. But again, this is exactly what Gothic cathedrals would have looked like back in the day. They would have taken 200 years to finish construction. They were very, very slow. They went through different designers' hands. So there is that front. This is what it's eventually going to look like. what I think is so incredible about Gaudí Sagrada Familia is every time I look at it, when it has one more step completed, it looks like it's finished. And then you look at that graphic and you see just how much more he designed into it, right? You think that you have the high points, but you're only at like the fourth highest point, and you still have 3 more pinnacles to reach after that. Now we're going to hop over to the United States, which might look a little bit underwhelming after looking at Gaudí, but I think it's a pretty good segue into what we're going to get into on Monday, which is going to be modernism. So in the United States, we have Louis Sullivan, and his version of the Art Deco is going to be a little bit more subtle, and you're going to have to be really up close to look at it. And I think you can see that in this building. It looks very normal. It doesn't look very much different from any other building you can see. It does have its rustic base, its top, but it's really on the interior where he begins to carve out these spaces. So this is the auditorium room, and notice the forms that he's using inside of it. Again, they are sculpted, they are not just orthogonal lines. Even the shape of it in plan, you can see it's not symmetrical. The entryway, you can see, it might have looked like regular run-of-the-mill rustic base, but notice that it's much more irregular than that, right? So we do have a couple of pieces at the top sticking out. It is not uniform. It does look a little bit more eroded. And then inside the auditorium itself, he does use what we call these little plaster casts. And then they put these forms, or rather they make the forms, they put the plaster inside of it, and then they copy and paste them all over the place. So all of these are cast, and then they're applied to the surface in a very low relief ornament. So this is what it looks like in the United States. It's much more industrial. And it's not as voluminous as what you see in Spain. But it still exists. So this is one example where they actually did attempt for it to be a column. So you can see that they're using a capital up there. They do integrate light into the column in this case. And then this is what the mold would have looked like for that top piece. So Louis Sullivan's is a little bit more subtle. You do have to be up close to really look at it. But even then, you can see that when you're making the molds for these pieces, even that requires a lot of work, which people don't want to necessarily invest money into. This is a storefront down here. So we're looking at the bottom of it. Again, from far away, it doesn't really catch your attention much. It's nothing really compared to Gaudí's work. But it's once you get up close and you begin to see all of this detail that you can see the art approach through. And you can see Louis Sullivan's style is much more about repetition. So he creates one, and then it's just copied and pasted all over the facade. So technically it is less work than what Gaudí is proposing, but even this is too much work for what modernism is going to call for. Because if you think about it, even though this comes out of a mold, you have to be very careful when you're taking it out, because these are very delicate thin pieces that are sitting here, right? That's what we're going to talk about next week. All right. So for this week, I did want to share really quickly, you guys do have a reading that's more so skimming and looking at an architecture competition. So I'm going to show you what competitions look like back during this time period. And this one is for a